The call came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was in the kitchen, standing at the counter with a mug of coffee that had gone lukewarm, watching the neighbor's dog nose around the edge of my front lawn the way he always does. Nothing unusual about the morning. The leaves on the oak tree out front had started turning that deep amber color, the kind that used to make my wife Eleanor say the whole street looked like it was on fire. She passed 4 years ago. I still look at that tree every fall and think of her. My phone buzzed against the counter. I looked down and saw it was my daughter-in-law calling. Not my son. Her. I picked up. "Did the wire go through?" she said. No hello, no good morning. Just that. I set down my mug. "I'm sorry?" "The wire transfer. The one Marcus asked you to send last week for the equipment lease. Did it go through?" I told her I'd have to check. She said to let her know as soon as possible because they were behind on the timeline. Then she hung up. I stood there in my kitchen for a moment looking at the phone in my hand. My son Marcus is 41 years old. He's a physical therapist. Good one from what I understand. And 3 years ago he came to me with a plan. He and his wife Tessa wanted to open their own outpatient rehabilitation center. They'd been renting space inside a larger medical office for years, and they were ready, they said, to have something of their own. Marcus sat across from me at the same kitchen table where I've eaten breakfast every morning for 27 years, and he laid out the numbers: equipment, lease deposit, licensing, staffing, build-out. He had a folder. He had projections. He was thorough. And he was excited in the way I hadn't seen him since he was a teenager talking about baseball. I told him I'd think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I talked to my accountant. I looked at what I had in savings, what I'd put aside from the sale of my hardware business 8 years earlier, what Eleanor and I had set aside for retirement. I was 64 at the time, and I wasn't planning on going back to work. The money I had was the money I had. I decided to do it, $10,000. I wrote it out in a personal check at that kitchen table, and I slid it across to Marcus, and I told him one thing. I said, "Marcus, this is not a gift. I want to be clear about that. This is an investment. I'm not asking for a seat at the table every week. I'm not going to be looking over your shoulder, but I need you to know that I take this seriously, and I need you to take it seriously too." He shook my hand. He said, "Dad, I promise." I believed him. The rehabilitation center was called Peak Motion. They found a space in a commercial building about 12 miles from my house, in a part of town that had been growing for a few years. Good location. Easy parking. The kind of place people can get in and out of without much hassle, which matters when your patients are recovering from knee replacements and rotator cuff surgeries. For the first year and a half, the updates were regular. Marcus would call on Sunday afternoons, sometimes stop by the house. He'd tell me where they were in the build-out, what equipment they'd ordered, what the contractor said about the timeline. Tessa was involved too, handling the business side, the billing, the insurance contracts, the payroll. Marcus was the clinical director. They were a team. Somewhere in the second year, the Sunday calls got shorter, then less frequent. Then they stopped. I told myself it was because they were busy. Opening a business is not a small thing. I'd opened my own business at 32, and there were months in those early years where I barely slept. I gave them the benefit of the doubt because that's what you do when it's your kid. You assume the best. You fill in the silence with reasonable explanations. I got updates when I asked for them. That was the shift I noticed but didn't name until much later. I stopped receiving information and started having to request it, and even then the answers were vague. Things are going well. We're still working on the insurance credentialing. The equipment delivery got delayed, but we're back on track. I stopped asking about a specific opening date because every time I did, the answer changed. So when Tessa called me that Tuesday in October asking about a wire transfer with no greeting and no context, something in me went still. I checked my online banking that afternoon. The wire had gone through 6 days earlier. $22,000 for what the memo line said was a lease extension and equipment upgrade package. I called Marcus. He didn't answer. I left a message asking him to call me back when he had a chance, that it wasn't urgent. I just wanted to catch up. He didn't call back that day, or the next. On the third day, I drove out to the address I had for Peak Motion. I'd been there twice during the build-out, once when they were still framing the interior walls, and once when the equipment was just starting to come in. Both times Marcus had walked me through personally, shown me the treatment rooms, the reception desk, explained where everything was going to go, I pulled into the parking lot and sat in my car for a moment. The sign above the door said, Peak Motion Physical Therapy and Sports Rehabilitation. Clean lettering, professional. There were cars in the lot. Through the front window I could see people moving around inside. The place was open. It had been open, clearly, for some time. I didn't go in. I drove home. I sat in my driveway for 10 minutes before I went inside. I called Marcus again that evening. Again, voicemail. I kept my voice even. I said, Marcus, I drove by the clinic today. It looks like you've been open for a while. I'd love to hear about it. Call me. He didn't call. 2 days later, Tessa called me again. There's another invoice, she said. Liability insurance renewal and a new ultrasound unit. Marcus said he'd reach out, but he's been slammed. The total is $38,000. I'll email you the breakdown. I was standing in my living room when she said that. I looked out the window at the driveway, at the oak tree, at the ordinary Tuesday afternoon light falling across the yard. I said, Tessa, when did Peak Motion open? There was a pause. Short, but I noticed it. End of August, she said. Why? It was the 3rd week of October. That's nearly 8 weeks, I said. 7.5, yeah. It's been a really busy stretch. I wasn't there, I said. Another pause. We did a soft open. Very low-key. Just staff and a few close people. I'm his father, I said. I put in $310,000. I know, and we really appreciate that. Marcus is going to take you to lunch. He's just been... I'd like to speak to Marcus, I said. She said she'd have him call me. He didn't call me that day either. I want to be careful here about how I describe what I felt in those days, because I've had time now to sit with it, and I think the feeling was more layered than just anger. There was anger, yes, but underneath that there was something quieter and worse. It was the specific feeling of realizing that your presence in someone's life is conditional, that the warmth you believed was permanent was actually something that had limits you didn't know about. I had believed, without ever really testing the belief, that I was important to my son, not just useful, important. Standing in my kitchen that week, I started to wonder when that had changed. My neighbor Frank came over that Friday to return a ratchet set he'd borrowed in the spring. We ended up standing in my garage talking for an hour the way we do sometimes. I didn't tell him the whole story. I told him a version of it, enough. He listened without interrupting, which is one of the things I've always appreciated about Frank. He said, "What are you going to do?" I told him I didn't know yet. I spent the weekend going through my files. I have a filing cabinet in the spare bedroom where I keep every financial document going back decades. I found the folder I'd started when Marcus and I first began talking about the investment. There was the original agreement we'd written up, just 2 pages, which in retrospect was not nearly thorough enough, but at the time felt like a formality between father and son. It specified the amount, said the money was an investment in the business, and noted that I would be considered a silent investor with right of first refusal if they ever decided to sell. There was no provision about what happened if they stopped communicating with me. There was no mechanism for what I was currently experiencing. I also found a detail I'd half forgotten. In the first year, Marcus had asked me for an additional $15,000 for a piece of equipment the insurance company had required for their credentialing. I'd sent it. There was the email chain to prove it. So the total I put in was $325,000. I called my accountant on Monday. His name is Richard. He's been doing my taxes for 15 years, and he's the kind of man who asks good questions before he says anything definitive. I walked him through the situation. He listened. Then he asked me if I'd ever been added to the business entity formally. I said I didn't think so. He said I should find out, and that I should also find out the exact legal structure of the business. I started looking into it that week. Peak Motion Physical Therapy, LLC, was registered in the state. The 2 listed members were Marcus and Tessa. Not me. I already knew I wasn't a formal partner. That had never been the arrangement. But there was something else that caught my attention when I dug a little further. There was a second entity, a management company, registered about 14 months ago, that had been set up to handle the lease and some of the equipment financing. The sole member of that company was listed as Tessa's maiden name, a name that appeared nowhere in the original conversations we'd had about the investment. I looked at that for a long time. I'm not a lawyer. I want to be clear about that. I'm a 67-year-old man who used to own a hardware store. but I have enough basic sense about business structures to understand that when money flows from an investment into an operating company and then out again through a separate management entity controlled by one person, that's worth asking about. I called my attorney. Her name is Beverly. She does estate planning primarily, but she knows enough about business law to review what I had and tell me if I needed a specialist. I sent her everything I'd found. She called me back the next afternoon and said, in her measured and precise way, that she thought it would be worth having a business litigation attorney take a look. She gave me a name. I met with the litigation attorney, a man named Gerald Okafor, 2 weeks later. I brought the original agreement, the wire transfer records, the state business registry printouts, everything I had. He reviewed it quietly and then looked up at me and said that what I had was potentially actionable depending on what the money had actually been used for and whether the management company had been capitalized with funds traceable to my investment. He said, "Do you want to pursue this or do you want to talk to your son first?" I said I wanted to talk to my son first. I called Marcus that evening and I didn't leave a voicemail. I sent him a text message instead. I said, "Marcus, I need to meet with you." Not a phone call. In person. This week. He texted back within 20 minutes, which told me he'd been seeing my calls. He said, "Is everything okay?" I said, "I need to talk to you about the business. Can you come to the house Thursday evening?" He said he'd be there. He came alone. I had expected Tessa to be with him, or had at least considered the possibility, but he came by himself. He looked tired. He sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd written him that check, and he wrapped both hands around the glass of water I'd set out, and he looked at me. I didn't raise my voice. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I've never been a man who shouts, and I wasn't going to start that night. I laid out what I knew, in order, the way I'd been thinking about it for weeks. The 7.5 weeks I hadn't known the clinic was open, the calls I'd made that went to voicemail, the invoice requests that came from his wife without a word from him, the second business entity I'd found, the questions I had about where the money had gone. He didn't interrupt me. When I finished, he sat back in his chair and looked at the table. Then he said, "Dad, I'm sorry." I told him I needed more than that. What came out over the next 2 hours was not a confession exactly, more like a gradual accounting. The soft opening had happened quickly, he said, and he'd kept meaning to call me, but the days kept moving, and he told himself he'd explain it when things settled down. That was the part I found hardest to accept. Not that it happened, but that there had been a version of events where he was going to eventually explain it and thought that was sufficient. About the management company, Tessa had set it up on the advice of their accountant for tax efficiency reasons, and some of the initial lease payments had been processed through it. He said he hadn't fully understood the implications. He said Tessa had handled most of the business structure decisions. I told him that regardless of who had handled it, my money was involved, and I deserved to understand how it had been used. I told him I'd hired an attorney. He looked at me differently when I said that. Not angry, something closer to the expression of a person who has finally understood that something is real. I told him what I needed, not as demands, as a list of requirements I'd thought through carefully over the preceding weeks. I needed a full accounting of every dollar I had invested, documented, with receipts and records. I needed the management company's financials reviewed by a neutral third party, and I needed to be formally recognized as an investor in writing, with a proper operating agreement that reflected what had actually happened and what my stake was. I also told him something that wasn't on any list. I told him that the money I could work through, the legal questions I could work through. What I didn't know how to work through was realizing that when the day finally came, the day he'd been working toward for 3 years, he hadn't thought to call me. I told him that was the part that was going to take the most time. He didn't have an answer for that. I wasn't expecting one. It took about 4 months to get the formal documentation completed. Marcus and Tessa, through their attorney and mine, produced a full financial accounting. The review came back clean on the larger question. The management company had been set up for the reasons Marcus had described, and there was no evidence of funds being misappropriated. What the review did confirm was that some of my investment had been processed through that entity without my knowledge, which was sloppy at best, and which resulted in a revised operating agreement that gave me a formal 6% equity stake in the business and a right to quarterly financial reports. It wasn't the outcome that changed the most about my life. 6% of a small rehabilitation center isn't a windfall. The quarterly reports are 3 pages of numbers that I read and file. What changed was simpler and harder to quantify. Marcus started calling me on Sunday afternoons again, not because I asked him to, He just did. The calls are different now. Not easy exactly, but honest in a way that some of our earlier conversations weren't. We talk about the clinic. We talk about his kids, my grandchildren, Owen, who's 8, and Marisol, who just turned 6. Sometimes we talk about nothing much at all, the same way I used to talk to my own father on the phone in his last years. Tessa and I have a civil relationship. I don't think we will ever be close. There is a polished quality to her warmth that I recognize now for what it is, and I think she recognizes that I recognize it. We are two people who love Marcus in different ways, and who have come to a workable understanding. That's enough. The thing I keep returning to, the thing that took me the longest to make sense of, is how quietly the distance had grown. There was no argument. There was no falling out. There was just a son who got busy, and a wife who was practical and efficient, and who had come to see me primarily as a financial resource, and the two of them together had drifted into a way of treating me that neither of them had probably sat down and decided on. It had just happened, the way things do when no one is paying attention. I don't entirely blame my son. I also don't entirely excuse him. What I learned, and what I'd say to any parent who was sitting where I was sitting 3 years ago with a checkbook and a child who needs help, put it in writing, all of it. Not because you don't trust your child, but because the paperwork is what forces both of you to say out loud exactly what this is. It requires you to have conversations you might otherwise skip. It requires your child to see you, not as a parent whose love is unconditional and therefore infinitely available, but as a person who is making a choice, a real choice, to invest something irreplaceable in their future. The money I put in came from 40 years of work. Some of it came from years I barely saw Marcus, because I was at the store before he woke up and home after he was in bed. That's a thing I carry. It's also a thing I wanted to do differently for him than my own father had done for me. My father died without ever seeing me build anything. I didn't want that. I still don't. The oak tree out front is bare now. Late November, the leaves went fast this year. One good windstorm, and they were gone. In the spring, they'll come back, same as they always do. Eleanor would have said something about that, something true and plain the way she always was. I'm learning to say it to myself. There's a version of the story where I say nothing, where I keep sending the wires, keep picking up when Tessa calls, keep filing the silence for Marcus under "he's busy." A lot of people live inside that version. I understand why. It's easier than the alternative, and when it's your child, easy has a pull that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't been there. But I've been thinking about what actually caused all of this. Not who, but what. And the honest answer is that it was a slow accumulation of small choices, each one unremarkable on its own. Marcus chose not to call when things got hectic. Then he chose not to call again. Tessa chose to see the financial relationship as a transaction rather than a trust. I chose to interpret their silence generously, past the point where generosity was warranted. None of us sat down and decided to arrive where we arrived. We just kept making the easier choice over and over, until the easier choices had built something neither of us wanted to live inside. That's the thing about how these situations develop. They don't announce themselves. They accumulate quietly, like water finding its level, until one Tuesday morning you're standing in your kitchen holding a phone and realizing the distance between you and your son has become something structural. What I did, eventually, was simply refuse to keep adding to the distance. Not with anger, not with ultimatums delivered in a raised voice. I sat Marcus down at the same table where I'd written him that check, and I told him the truth, plainly, without performing it. I told him what I found, what I needed, and what it had meant to me to drive out to that parking lot and understand from the outside that something I'd invested 3 years of hope into had already begun without me. That took more out of me than any of the legal paperwork did. Being honest about being hurt without weaponizing it is harder than most people admit. The intelligence in this situation, if there was any, wasn't in finding the second business entity or hiring the right attorney. Though both of those things mattered, the intelligence was in understanding that the goal was not to win. The goal was to restore something real. You can't restore a relationship by humiliating someone, even when humiliation is what the facts would justify. Marcus is my son. I wanted my son back, and I understood that meant I had to make it possible for him to come back without losing himself entirely in the process. That required me to separate what I needed legally from what I needed personally, and to address both, but not at the same time, and not in the same conversation. The perseverance was quieter still. It was the weeks of sitting with information I didn't want to have, of not acting on impulse, of letting Frank hand back that ratchet set, and not unloading everything on him all at once. It was deciding, deliberately, that I was not going to let what happened to the money determine what happened to my character. I'm 67 years old. I have grandchildren who call me on weekends. I have an oak tree in my front yard that Eleanor loved. I have a filing cabinet full of documents and a Sunday afternoon phone call that came back on its own. What you invest in people costs more than money. But the return, when it comes back honest, is worth more too.